What would you say it is that you do presently, and how did it all start?
Well, so it got started in, it, it was founded in April 2019. And then I would say that we launched in the fall of 2019. And the reason for that was there was kind of an observation uh, among some leaders and some veterans in the news industry that climate change, was clearly only getting worse, and yet there was still a persistent silence on the part of the news media in covering the issue. And that was because the issue was maybe considered too big and unwieldy to belief that audiences weren't interested in climate coverage, which we think was an incorrect belief. But it was always kind of dismissed as this kind of, wonky, kind of sciencey story that was tough to communicate to audiences, which means that, the a defining story of this, era that we're living in was going undercovered by the press, and people were not audiences were left misunderstanding climate change, thinking that it was maybe something optional to care about based on your personal politics. And then as a result, a follow-on result of that, there was no particular pressure on political leaders or on business leaders to take the necessary action that scientists say we must to ensure avoiding the worst of climate change. So it was founded by a grant. It was founded based on a grant by a very famous journalist in the United States named Bill Moyers. He provided a grant to us, and so it was founded with the Columbia Journalism Review, which is a kind of it's an organization that covers the media, based in New York, and it's kind of seen as of within the journalism space in the U.S., kind of a leader in the industry of talking about where is the journalism industry going, and also The Nation magazine, which is a historically progressive magazine in the U.S. It was founded by Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation, and then The Guardian, which historically has done really excellent climate coverage. It consistently has, changed its own ways within, among Guardian journalists, how they cover climate change and how much of a priority they treat it as. So they're really kind of seen as industry leaders on climate change. They're considered our lead partner. So we put out a call to news houses across the US, but also around the world, and said, hey, we're starting this. The goal is to just encourage more and better coverage. Who wants to join? And I think that we expected that we would maybe have a few dozen partners join on. But we were really astounded because instead we got hundreds that within just a few weeks responded to our call for partnership, which communicated to us that there was an understanding across the media that they weren't doing a very good job covering this issue, but nobody really knew how to take the first step. Nobody really knew how to, especially at a time when so many media organizations across the world are struggling financially. I think that there was just a lot of confusion about it is such a big issue. How do we totally reorient ourselves towards this? And it seemed like there was actually a desire for some type of organization to show up. And I think that was us, to kind of be a cheerleader for the industry and to be there as kind of a coach and a mentor and an organizer to help bring coverage into the future so that it's a better service to people on the climate issue. That fall of 2019, we put on what we called a week of coverage, a joint week of coverage, where we asked everybody to do as much climate coverage during a single week as possible. And that coincided with, I think, the UN General Assembly that year. And the idea was, there's so much news, especially in the US in the Trump era. It's difficult for any kind of important issue to break through to audiences or to kind of break through the political noise. Our hope was that if hundreds of outlets are all getting together to do as much climate coverage as they can, it is more likely to come across audiences' eyes. And there are a lot of things that our organization does, but we've continued to do joint weeks of coverage like that because we do think that it's kind of a good model. It gives everybody a goal to say, okay, yes, we are absolutely going to collaborate on this issue. We are going to plan to cover this issue seriously. And I would say, there's kind of a longer story there, but I think that it's kind of grown out from that original idea that somebody should be there to kind of organize the media on this issue and to cheerlead them.
Okay.
Is there anything in terms of just origin story, McDella, that you would add?
I don't think, did you mention, I think the point I really like, I don't know if you already mentioned before I was on, about, I think it was the UN's report that year in 2019 that urged all factors of business, all sectors, that they had a responsibility to take action on the climate. But they left out media. That wasn't an industry that they mentioned. And so I think that was a turn. I mean, I was brought on after that point. So Mark and Andy would tell me that for them urged them to say, media isn't really being held accountable to their share of and their responsibility in engaging and informing the public around the climate change and the climate crisis. And so I think that point for me is really important because I often feel like the media and journalism is forgotten as a huge, powerful entity in shaping public opinion and et cetera. So.
Yes, actually, I agree
Yeah,
with that
that's a good
entirely, but I would like you to speak more to it. Can you, in your own words, very briefly, let us know how important the media is in averting or mitigating climate change, the role that we play?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's not really as worthwhile to me to say it's more important than this or less important than that, right? But because I do think that as that report was trying to say, every sector has a responsibility. And I think media information is vital in that because that's the first touch point that many people have to engage with information and to understand the context at play, to educate others and to also understand what they can do to mitigate disaster in their own lives and what's coming for them. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important. Andy, what would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. I would just say that it is absolutely critical because especially in democratic societies, leaders respond to what their voters and their constituencies care about. And of course, those leaders have a responsibility themselves to lead their voters and their electorates. But if people just do not understand an issue, it's unlikely that political leaders are going to have the imperative to act on this issue, especially given the historical ties between many of those politicians or political parties with the fossil fuel industry across the world. So,
and it's journalism's responsibility and function to be able to communicate many times to elected officials what is important from the public, right? Because a lot of times, of course, activists and movements also do a lot of that communication and education, but journalism can decipher that and qualify and interpret what that means, with all the context and facts. And a lot of the times, journalists are the ones that are holding elected officials accountable to their responsibility.
I'd like to move on to the CCNow journey. I'd like to understand the milestones that you have gone through. You mentioned earlier that the feedback you got from the different media establishments was just overwhelming. You thought you'd have just a dozen, but hundreds responded. Outside that, what else just stuck? A moment that you just can't forget.
I mean, for me, this is maybe jumping ahead, is not like in chronological order, but for me, I think seeing the climate crisis and CCNow being mentioned on Good Morning America. It was Good Morning America.
Today
The
Show.
Today Show. Thank you. It was like, I just, after I said that, I was like, it wasn't Good Morning America. On the Today Show.
It's probably the most watched show in America, to be
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah.
That for me was really pretty amazing. And it's one of those things that's like not as quantifiable, like the impact of that, but more so just knowing prior to that, the lack of coverage on those mainstream mediums, and then seeing that happen, and seeing it brought in a way that was like digestible to audiences during COVID at that time, I thought was really compelling. Yeah. And NBC, a major network, also joined on to the partnership at that time, which was a big milestone too.
I think there have been a few moments for me. I mean, one of the things that we do, Nelson, during these joint weeks of coverage is we try to, and we actually do this consistently, is we try to make stories that are published by various partners shareable or republishable for free by other partners of ours, by everybody else in the partnership. And the idea behind that is that I think that there's this focus, and you alluded to this a little bit in the questions that you sent. You talked about, the financial bottom line and how media outlets are kind of chasing financial success. I think that our idea was that, yes, there's competition in the industry, and competition is important to, kind of sharpening everyone and making, everyone, it helps us all get better. But this story is too important, and resources are too slim across the media for everybody to be concerned only about their bottom line. So we were saying that getting great stories in front of more audiences is more important than any individual outlets claim to exclusivity on a story. And so something that's always been cool for me is seeing a story that originated in in one of our outlet partners, like the HuffPost or the Guardian, maybe, seeing it republished across many different media organizations, and even seeing it translated and showing up in foreign newspapers, seeing the Covering Climate Now logo on the front page of a newspaper in Tokyo. That's always been really cool. It's just kind of like the media is kind of finding a way to speak with one voice on an issue. And in fact, during that 2019, talking about moments where, we're actually making an impact. During that 2019 week of coverage during the UN General Assembly, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was giving a speech about climate change at the UN. And she said, I don't know if you all will have heard of this, but there's this organization called Covering Climate Now that's bringing a lot of outlets together, and a lot of New Zealand outlets are participating, I'm proud to say. And so it was kind of cool that, like, oh man, we've even gotten on Jacinda Ardern's radar, just because it's so kind of unusual or unique to see the media really rallying around an issue.
Mm-hmm. And collaborating.
Yeah.
So in an issue. Yeah, for sure.
And and then there have been great moments where something like, NBC, which is a major outlet in the US, Reuters, which is obviously a very internationally important outlet, Bloomberg, these kind of very big media houses coming to us and saying that they want to be on board. And our pitch to them is that being a part of Covering Climate Now helps them kind of present themselves as leaders in the industry on this very important issue. So the fact that that message has convinced, like Bloomberg financially does not need any help from us. Like it might be true that like certain small outlets that are from a small town or that have small readership, it kind of helps those outlets to be a partner of something like this because it maybe maybe just elevates their presence a little bit. But something like Bloomberg and Reuters don't need any help from us. So I think that it's good that we've been able to sell this message to them and that they've said yes, we want to be a part of that.
Oh, yeah. I would like to move on right now to the different methods that you're using to coordinate this response to climate change, the media response. I've noticed on your page the use of hyperlinks. You're suggesting job opportunities every now and then also standout stories. What other methods are you looking into to have more impactful and more impactful coverage that reaches a vast audience?
We do a lot of different things. We do organize these kind of events that I think are going to turn out about twice a year that focus on certain issues. So we had that first one in 2019. Last spring in April 2020, we had one focused on climate solutions because it's so important that people understand that a lot of solutions to climate change are available now. And then in September, we had one focused.
Sorry, I just want to mention, these are the joint coverage weeks that,
Right.
yeah, talking about.
So these are the joint coverage weeks. And then in September of 2020, we had one focused on climate and politics, the intersection of those issues. We host pretty regularly webinars that we're calling Talking Shop, where hundreds of journalists dial into a Zoom meeting where we have coordinated with our executive director, Mark Hertzgaard, and a few kind of prominent climate journalists, either reporters or editors, to talk about a specific issue, such as extreme weather, such as environmental and racial justice and their intersection with climate change, such as coronavirus stimulus spending, meaning all of the spending that governments are doing in the wake of coronavirus and how that needs to be green. We host these events so that folks can listen to some leading journalists kind of working out what are the challenges of covering this issue, what are some of the opportunities of covering this issue, what are the things that we as journalists need to do better, and then everybody who's dialed in on the line, which usually we have a good, a couple hundred folks, is able to take away lessons from that and apply it to their coverage that they're doing. I think that we try to, and Magdala can talk to this a little bit, but we try to, through our various social media accounts, highlight examples of good coverage and say, more of this, please, or call out bad examples of coverage. And then a lot of it is just based on, to be honest with you, one-on-one meetings with newsroom leaders, where a couple of us or a few of members of our team are in direct conversation with editors and reporters from various outlets and just talking to them about their coverage. And they're soliciting ideas from us. We're suggesting different ways to tell stories. So I think, I mean, all of these are, professionals. I don't want to act like they don't know what they're doing. They're all, very good at being journalists, but I think that we're there to provide just a little bit of extra, maybe mentorship on the climate issue and a little bit of encouragement.
Yeah, I think just to add on to some of the resources that we provide, sometimes in tandem with the joint coverage weeks and sometimes on their own, we'll write reporting guides to support the coverage weeks or to support a specific area of focus that we feel or that we've been asked by journalists that they need help with and training in. And so we publish those on our website and share them in our newsletters and on social. And then we also will do a newsletter is in our climate beat is also I think a great resource that we provide, which is our media analysis, weekly or bi-weekly or bi-monthly. And then also I think through social, we try to actually have a conversation with journalists, and we're trying to do this more and more. So be able to have more of a conversational tone where journalists feel, or editors or anyone who works in a newsroom feel comfortable to ask questions, as well as the public feel comfortable to tag us like in a specific story and say like, what do you think of this? Like, I really think this is great coverage. What do you think, kind of a thing. And it's been really nice to see that actually to start happening, and to see that people are excited by having a go-to organization to follow that guides them, both the public and journalists, on what is good reporting, and can analyze that in a little bit more detail, and say like what makes it good and bad, what makes it impactful, what doesn't. And so also we do some posts on our site that I think are ways of providing guidance on what we think could use more reporting. So like around, or even what voices should be highlighted more. So I think this last year we saw a lot of young people like really pushing the climate conversation forward, and noticed that they weren't really, that conversation and that movement wasn't really getting the coverage that really it deserved across the media. And so we urged and we encouraged our partners to do that reporting through the conversations that Andy noted. A lot of that happens in just the conversations that we have with our partners, but also we tried to highlight that through providing resources. So we did a list of like young leaders. I think it's almost 100 people on that list, and provided that online for journalists to be able to use as a resource to reach out to the movement builders and have those contacts, as well as a way of highlighting and amplifying those voices. And we did a similar thing with the Georgia runoffs here, which was an important race after the 2020 election. So just to highlight some specific things that are examples of work that we're trying to do more of too.
Okay.
Nelson, I would recommend going to our website and clicking on the tab at the top that says resources. And when you click that, the very first thing that comes up is best practices, which are 10 kind of rules of thumb that we say all news outlets should try to follow when dealing with climate change. They're kind of, I think they're good. It's a good rundown of what we think makes good climate coverage. And when Magdala's talking about people engaging us on this conversation, I think one of the things that's always cool to see is when a publication does something that would be seen as not constructive in this conversation, such as giving a platform to people who deny the existence of climate change, or to fossil fuel companies which try to kind of greenwash their own image, or kind of present what I think that we would either call misinformation or an outright lie, and journalists kind of give them platforms for that. When people out there, just random people out there, are seeing stories like this in the publications they care about, they're tagging us on Twitter and saying like, this is BS, and then they're adding covering climate now to kind of bring our attention to bad examples of coverage. So I don't want to say it's only bad examples. They obviously bring our attention to good examples too. But it's cool that shows that people are out there thinking about us. They know we exist in the climate journalism space, and that we're kind of helping to lead that conversation.
Oh yes, I was wondering if I would be encapsulating everything if I said that good climate coverage is the type of reporting that creates relatability amongst the audience, and does so in a sustained manner, and generating effort towards that particular issue. Would I be comprehensive if I said that? And what would you focus on the most amongst these best practices?
I think that's good. I think that what you said sounds good. I don't know if there is a single best practice that I would call most important, because it's obviously such a big issue, and there are so many different facets of how it's covered and how different publications or broadcast channels operate. So I don't want to say that one is more important than others. I think that a term that is important is a term that is important and that we're talking increasingly about here at Covering Climate Now is the idea of a climate emergency. A climate emergency, different than a climate crisis or climate change, is a term that some publications might be wary of using because they don't want to seem like activists. But I think that what we say is that that is the preferred term of thousands of scientists around the world. And they've been using the term climate emergency for even years now. So coverage that conveys a sense of emergency, similar to how the media around the world reacted quickly and in force to cover coronavirus. What would it look like if the media took climate change as seriously and as all-encompassing as they treated coronavirus? I think that that is a model of what it looks like for the media to treat something like an emergency. And we say that if something is an emergency, that means that it requires urgent action and attention now. So we are in an emergency, according to scientists. So as a media organization, is our coverage reflecting that? I think that coverage that treats climate change as less than an emergency is in fact inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that we've really wanted to get across to folks is it's not activism to take this issue seriously and to give it, front page billing. It's purely a matter of it is what the story calls for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think too, when something is an emergency, as COVID is, every facet of the newsroom figures out how to cover it, right? Because it, in everyone's real life, affects how we live in all facets of our lives. So why would it be siloed in the newsroom to a specific beat or a specific storyline? And so, as we saw, every type of reporter was reporting on COVID related to their domain. And in that same way, climate change should be treated that way in the newsroom. And in that same way, I'm sure journalists needed to, re-up their education around COVID, around pandemics, to be able to report on it. And so we hope to provide those kinds of resources to journalists so that every journalist across the newsroom can report on climate change intersectionally from their beat, from their perspective.
Right. We always want to say that climate change is not just the responsibility of the climate reporter or the science reporter or the environmental reporter. It's everybody in the newsroom's job to grapple with this all-encompassing issue, to understand it and to incorporate it into their work. So that means politics reporters, business reporters, entertainment and sports reporters. It means all of their editors. It means headline writers. It means social media teams. It means audience engagement people. It means everyone kind of incorporating this issue into their work where it makes sense to do so, rather than treating it as like, oh, that's just a science story. Like, leave it to those science writers over there, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes, it does. And you mentioned that we should take this really seriously, but recently I had an interaction with a prominent journalist over here, and I asked him why there was more coverage in print than there was in broadcast media, and his response was, Africans and Ugandans in particular do not really appreciate climate change stories, so we don't really head there. That's what he was saying. My words, though, but it was around the same point. That might not be true, but it speaks to the fact that this is the way things are in these media establishments. How do you suggest we do this practically to teach morality? As you stated in this article, journalists have a moral obligation to declare a climate change emergency.
I don't necessarily know how to, address a big picture of like changing culture with respect to issues. But I would say, and I thought about this with one of the questions that you sent us in advance, but it is the kind of newsroom executives and the leaders, who are the ones that primarily care about ratings and finances. I don't think that a lot of reporters and editors and individual like video shooters get into journalism because they only care about money. They, in fact, at least in the United States, we're not particularly well paid as journalists. So it's a bad industry to get into if you care about money. I think that people care about stories. And a lot of what people love about journalism is the opportunity to share the stories of the world and the important stories of the day with the communities that they live in and the communities that they report to. So I think that this idea that, that the person shared with you, I'm not criticizing that person's idea, but this idea that, oh, audiences don't really care about this issue, so we can't cover it so much. That's kind of a misunderstanding, in my opinion, of the journalist's role. Like, it's our job as journalists to tell stories in ways that people understand when they are important stories to understand. It's our job to look at the news of the day, to interpret and analyze what's important to our audiences, and to tell it to them in a compelling way. So if we're saying, oh, audiences don't care about climate change, which I don't want to speak for Africans, but I think an awful lot of Africans are deeply affected by climate change in countries across the continent, and especially in coastal communities and in communities in Central Africa affected by drought. There are so many people that I think are probably hungry for information about what climate change is, how it's going to affect their lives, what their government leaders are doing or not doing about it, how businesses are playing a role. It's the responsibility of the journalists to find ways to engage audiences on this issue and to, to convey a sense of importance that even if the audience doesn't understand how important this is, it's the journalist's responsibility to explain why it's important.
Right. Yeah. And to figure out like what is the way that it's impacting or affecting their lives right now. That's the approach that the story should take, is how is it affecting their lives, right? Because I definitely understand, and I think this gets like overstated too much, and I think played up into kind of the comment that this person made around just like climate change stories being this like really high, like ominous, like large bucket of information that isn't as place-based, if that makes sense. Like, it doesn't get pulled down to the locality of a specific people and a specific community and their issues. And so I get that, like when we hear like polar bears don't have ice and the certain temperature around the world is lowered by 0.4%. Like, those kinds of things are really hard for me to attach myself to and to understand how it's affecting me and my life where I am. But if we can take it to that level, I think a lot of people would be really, really interested. And I think are hoping for stories like that, so that it can affect their lives. Yeah.
I would say climate change is going to affect all of us eventually. It is already affecting the kind of least fortunate among us around the world, developing countries, in developed societies, communities of color, indigenous groups, the poor. It is already climate change is already having a heavy, heavy toll on those communities. And it's going to have a toll on all of our communities and everything that we know, from, business to, citizenship, to how we interact with our governments, to what we need from our governments, is going to change because of this issue. And a story that big, I don't really buy it when a journalist says we can't find a way to, share this with our audience in a way that's meaningful to them. A kind of colloquialism in the U.S. is that's a cop-out. I don't know if you have that saying.
No, we don't.
What's that?
We do not.
Okay. It means that it's a deflection of responsibility that is actually your responsibility. Like, saying
it's like an easy way. It's an easy way out. It's like, oh, I can just divert. Yeah.
So I think it's journalists' responsibility to find the way to make the story compelling to audiences.
Okay. Yes, my computer is reminding me here that we have 4 minutes left. I had two questions, so I do not know if we can wrap this up real quick. I was hoping that you'd share your prospects for the next 5 to 10 years. Where do you see CCNow and climate coverage generally? And also, you spoke to the different challenges, mindset change being one of those. What else are these challenges that you have to surmount before you actually arrive at impactful journalism that you have experienced over these past 2 years?
But I think one of the biggest challenges for journalism is believing that story with urgency is an act of activism, and journalists don't want to be perceived as activists, and we of course understand that. And I think that my answer to that is what I said earlier, that it's not activism, it's accuracy. Like, telling this story with urgency and treating it as an emergency is what the science says we must do as journalists. It's telling the story in a truthful way to treat it as an emergency and to take this very seriously. But I think that it's a challenge because not everybody in the media is used to thinking in that way. Everybody's very concerned about appearing impartial. And for a wide variety of reasons, climate change has been politicized, and they don't want to be, appear to be taking political sides on an issue. And we have to say that that's not what the facts say. You have to go with the facts as a journalist, not with fears of perception. And to answer very quickly your first question about where do we see CCNow in the long run, we are a very young organization. We've only been around for a little under 2 years at this point. And I think that we don't know exactly what the long term looks like. In the coming few years, though, I think that we want to continue to find ways to bring more journalists into the fold, to get the whole newsroom working on climate change, like McDella spoke about earlier, to get every reporter in the newsroom taking climate change seriously and integrating it into their work and their reporting. I think that that's going to be a large focus of effort for us, is a all of newsroom approach to climate coverage, rather than just climate reporters writing about climate coverage. And we're going to continue to provide training and mentorship to that extent.
Yeah.
Adele, do you have anything to add?
I mean, really, really quickly, I think two other challenges I think are definitely, I think disinformation and misinformation is going to accelerate. And I think especially in the climate space. So I think we have a task at hand there. And then also I think media business models. I think that we don't really play in that area as much or speak on that, other than the fact that lack of resources is a huge issue for climate reporting. So I think as that changes, we will want to provide resources to that end. Yeah.